"Ma'am, step away from the podium before I arrest you." The command cracked through the marble lobby of City Hall so sharply that even the reporters near the entrance stopped talking. Camera lights reflected off the polished floors while rain hammered the tall glass windows overlooking downtown Ashbury. The emergency press conference was supposed to begin in less than 10 minutes, and every local news station in the state had already gone live. People stood shoulder to shoulder beneath giant television monitors showing flooded neighborhoods, collapsed roads, and families huddled beneath red emergency blankets. At the center of the chaos stood a black woman in a dark charcoal trench coat, water still dripping from the hem onto the stone floor. She looked exhausted, like someone who had been awake for 20 straight hours, but her posture remained calm. Officer Ryan Keller moved toward her with controlled urgency, one hand, near the radio, clipped to his belt. 6'2", broad-shouldered, former Marine, known inside City Hall for never bending rules. Ryan had spent the entire morning dealing with protesters trying to push into restricted areas. The governor was late. The mayor was panicking. Reporters were growing restless. And now this woman had walked straight past 2 security checkpoints and headed directly toward the main podium where city officials were preparing maps for the statewide flood response. I said stop. Ryan stepped in front of her, blocking the stage. The woman lifted her eyes toward him slowly. They were steady, not angry, not afraid, just tired in a way that seemed heavier than the rain outside. "I need to see the relief numbers before this briefing starts," she said quietly. Her voice barely rose above the hum of television equipment. Ryan glanced at the laminated badge clipped beneath her coat collar, but the photo was partly covered by rainwater and the lettering had smeared. "That area is restricted to authorized personnel only," he replied. Around them, reporters began whispering to one another. A cameraman zoomed in. Somebody near the back muttered, "Another activist trying to hijack the briefing." Entire counties were highlighted in deep red. Thousands displaced. Shelters over capacity. National Guard requests pending approval. She stared at the numbers for a moment before speaking again. "How many evacuation buses made it to East Ward?" Ryan frowned. "That's not your concern. It becomes everyone's concern when children spend the night sleeping in gymnasiums without heat." Her answer landed harder than he expected. The lobby seemed to quiet for half a second. Then the crackle of police radios filled the silence again. Ryan straightened his shoulders. "Ma'am, I'm asking one final time. Step away from the podium." Instead, she took another step forward. Gasps rippled through the room. Several reporters instantly lifted their phones higher, sensing conflict. Ryan reached gently for her arm to stop her movement. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The woman finally turned fully toward him. Rainwater still clung to the edges of her curls, and beneath the harsh white lights of City Hall, exhaustion lined her face in quiet shadows. But there was something else there too. Disappointment. The kind that came from seeing the same thing happen too many times. "You saw a threat before you saw a person," she said softly. Ryan opened his mouth to answer, but suddenly the elevator doors behind them slid open with a metallic chime that echoed through the lobby. Mayor Thomas Whitmore stepped out quickly with 3 senior aides behind him, loosening his tie while reading notes from a tablet. "Where is she?" he snapped impatiently. "The governor's office said she arrived 10 minutes ago." Then his eyes lifted. He froze mid-step. The color drained from his face so fast, it looked almost unreal beneath the fluorescent lights. Around the room, cameras slowly turned toward the woman Ryan was still holding by the arm. The mayor swallowed hard. "Officer Keller," he said carefully, his voice barely above a whisper now. "What exactly are you doing with Governor Evelyn Brooks?" For 3 full seconds, nobody in the lobby moved. The flashing red recording lights on the news cameras continued blinking in complete silence while rain rolled down the 30-foot glass walls behind the stage like sheets of liquid steel. Officer Ryan Keller slowly released his grip from Governor Evelyn Brooks's arm, as if he had suddenly touched a live wire. Around him, reporters exchanged stunned looks. One producer lowered her headset and whispered, "Oh my God." Another camera operator immediately zoomed tighter onto Ryan's face. The mayor descended the marble steps quickly, his polished shoes striking the floor in sharp echoes that carried through the lobby. "Governor Brooks," Thomas Whitmore said breathlessly, extending both hands at once. "I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding." Evelyn looked at him calmly, but did not immediately shake his hand. Water dripped from the edge of her coat sleeve onto the marble between them. Up close, exhaustion showed clearly beneath her eyes. She looked less like a politician arriving for a press conference, and more like someone who had personally walked through every flooded neighborhood shown on the giant screens behind her. "Mr. Mayor," she said quietly, "people in East Ward spent 14 hours waiting for evacuation buses that never came." Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the room more sharply than shouting would have. Whitmore swallowed hard. "We are still coordinating with emergency management. Children slept in middle school cafeterias without blankets," Evelyn continued. "And half your generators failed before midnight." Ryan stood frozen beside them, heat rising into his face despite the cold draft coming from the storm outside. He had spent years believing confidence came from never second-guessing himself. But now every decision from the last 5 minutes replayed in his mind with brutal clarity. The smeared badge, her calm voice, the way she had looked at the relief maps instead of the cameras. He realized she had never acted defensive because she had never needed to prove she belonged there. A reporter suddenly stepped forward from the crowd. "Governor Brooks, were you denied entry to your own emergency briefing?" More microphones immediately lifted toward her. Mayor Whitmore's jaw tightened. "No questions right now," he snapped quickly. But the room had already shifted. The tension was no longer about the flood crisis alone. It had become something else entirely. Evelyn glanced once toward Ryan. He expected anger, public humiliation, maybe even demands for suspension. Instead, her expression remained unreadable. "Officer Keller was doing what he believed his job required," she said carefully. Ryan looked up in surprise. "But there is a difference between protecting a building and deciding who belongs inside it." The words landed heavily. Several reporters exchanged looks while typing rapidly into their phones. Somewhere near the back of the room, a television producer whispered, "That quote is leading every station tonight." The mayor rubbed his forehead nervously. "Governor, the press conference is ready whenever you are." Evelyn did not move immediately. Instead, she turned toward the giant relief map, glowing blue and red across the stage. Entire neighborhoods remained underwater. Shelters were over capacity by almost 40%. Hospitals near the riverfront were already running low on backup fuel. The storm had exposed every weakness the city spent years pretending did not exist. "How many rescue boats reached South Harbor?" she asked suddenly. One of the emergency coordinators glanced at his tablet. "Only 3 so far." Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly. "There should have been 12 by dawn." Nobody answered. The silence itself became the answer. Outside, thunder rolled low across the city skyline. Ryan noticed something then that unsettled him even more than the mayor's reaction earlier. Governor Brooks was not focused on what had happened to her. She was focused on the people still trapped in the storm. While cameras chased scandal and politicians worried about headlines, she kept returning to flooded streets, missing buses, overcrowded shelters, and frightened families. It made his mistake feel even smaller and somehow far worse. A young assistant hurried toward the stage carrying fresh briefing folders, but the papers slipped from her trembling hands, scattering across the marble floor. Evelyn bent down immediately to help gather them before anyone else reacted. Reporters watched silently as the governor knelt beside the nervous assistant, calmly stacking soaked pages one by one beneath the harsh white lights of City Hall. Ryan stared at the scene without speaking, because in that moment, he realized the most powerful person in the building had also been the calmest one in the room the entire time. The briefing began 6 minutes late, but nobody in City Hall seemed to care anymore. Every television camera remained locked on Governor Evelyn Brooks as she stepped behind the podium beneath the enormous state seal mounted against the wall. The bright studio lights overhead reflected against the rainwater still clinging to her dark coat, creating small flashes of silver each time she moved. Mayor Whitmore stood slightly behind her now, unusually quiet, while emergency coordinators shuffled papers with nervous hands around the edges of the stage. Officer Ryan Keller remained near the side entrance beside a marble column, posture rigid, eyes fixed on the governor. The embarrassment still burned in his chest like heat trapped beneath heavy armor. But deeper than embarrassment was confusion. He had expected outrage from her, public anger, political theater. Instead, she had protected his dignity in front of every camera in the state, even after he failed to recognize hers. "Good afternoon," Evelyn said calmly into the microphone. The room fell instantly silent. Before we discuss budgets, infrastructure, or emergency timelines, I want to talk about families. Her voice carried through the hall with steady warmth. An elderly man there had not received insulin in 16 hours because floodwaters blocked the pharmacy route. She paused briefly, looking across the room instead of reading from prepared notes. And outside the East Shelter parking lot, I watched volunteers carrying bottled water through waist-deep water while arguing over which streets emergency crews forgot. The words settled heavily over the crowd. Nobody interrupted. Thunder rolled outside again, low and distant, vibrating faintly through the glass walls. Ryan glanced toward the giant relief map glowing behind the stage. Entire neighborhoods blinked red with emergency warnings. Earlier that morning, he had only seen restricted access points and crowd control problems. She saw people. That difference unsettled him more with every passing minute. Evelyn rested both hands lightly against the podium. Disasters reveal things, she continued softly. Not only broken roads or damaged buildings. They reveal what systems fail first and who gets ignored fastest. Mayor Whitmore shifted slightly beside her. Across the room, several city officials avoided eye contact altogether. The people suffering tonight are not statistics on a screen, Evelyn said. They are families waiting in darkness, wondering if anybody important remembers they exist. Ryan noticed a young reporter near the front discreetly wiping tears beneath her glasses. Another cameraman slowly exhaled and adjusted focus without speaking. Even the police officers stationed along the walls seemed less tense now, their radios quieter beneath the weight of the governor's words. Evelyn looked directly toward the side of the room where Ryan stood. Not dramatically, not accusingly, just directly. Respect matters most during crisis, she said. Because fear makes people forget how to see each other clearly. Ryan felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. It was not humiliation anymore. It was recognition. He remembered the first thing he noticed about her when she entered City Hall. Wet clothes. No visible security detail. A tired black woman moving toward a restricted area during a chaotic emergency. His instincts had built a story before she ever finished speaking. And now every camera in the state had witnessed it happen in real time. A sudden burst of static crackled through somebody's emergency radio near the back wall. Then another voice came urgently across the channel. Additional levee failure reported near South Harbor. Water rising fast. The room instantly shifted again. Staff members rushed toward laptops. Emergency coordinators exchanged panicked looks. Mayor Whitmore cursed quietly under his breath. But Evelyn remained completely still behind the podium. Calm. Focused. Present. How many residents are still waiting for evacuation? She asked immediately. Possibly 300. An aide answered nervously. Evelyn nodded once. Then we do not have time for politics today. She stepped away from the podium before the reporters could ask a single question. Her coat swayed softly behind her as she moved toward the emergency operations table near the stage. City officials hurried after her almost automatically, like gravity itself had shifted direction inside the building. Ryan watched silently from the edge of the room while rain continued sliding down the windows behind them. For the first time since putting on the uniform 8 years earlier, he began wondering whether authority meant controlling people or actually protecting them. The emergency operations room on the second floor felt nothing like the polished image City Hall usually showed the public. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee, overheated electronics, and rain carried in through constantly opening doors. Large digital monitors covered one entire wall, glowing with satellite weather feeds, flood maps, and emergency call statistics that climbed higher every few minutes. Staff members moved quickly between folding tables covered in tangled charging cables, half-empty water bottles, and stacks of printed evacuation reports. Governor Evelyn Brooks stood at the center of it all with her sleeves rolled slightly above her wrists now, studying a county map spread across the table beneath harsh fluorescent lights. Damp coat rested over the back of a chair nearby, still dripping small pools of rainwater onto the gray tile floor. South Harbor levee failed at 6:14 this morning. An emergency coordinator explained nervously while pointing at the map. Water pushed 3 blocks inland in under 20 minutes. Evelyn traced the edge of the flooded zone silently with one finger. How many nursing homes are inside the evacuation radius? The coordinator hesitated. We are still confirming. She lifted her eyes slowly. That means you do not know. Nobody answered. Around the room, keyboards clacked faster. Phones rang without pause. Television coverage from downstairs continued playing silently on mounted monitors, every station replaying footage of the confrontation in the lobby beneath scrolling headlines. Ryan Keller noticed it immediately from the doorway. He had remained outside the operations room for almost 10 minutes, debating whether he should leave entirely or request reassignment. Instead, he found himself standing quietly near the entrance holding a cardboard tray with 4 untouched coffees from the vending station downstairs. The guilt sitting in his chest refused to loosen. Earlier that morning, he had believed experience made him good at reading people. Now he wondered how many times he had confused authority with assumption without ever noticing it. Inside the room, Mayor Whitmore rubbed both hands across his face. "We cannot move everybody before nightfall," he muttered. "Not with half the roads blocked." Evelyn remained focused on the map. "Then stop trying to move everybody at once." Several officials looked up. She pointed toward a narrow corridor highlighted beside the river district. "Use Route 17 for buses only. Shut civilian traffic down completely for 6 miles. One transportation official frowned. "That would paralyze downtown." Evelyn looked at him evenly. "People trapped on rooftops are already experiencing something worse than traffic." Silence followed. Then suddenly chairs scraped backward as departments began relaying new orders through radios and phones. Ryan watched the shift happen in real time. Panic slowly transformed into movement. Direction. Purpose. She never raised her voice once, yet everybody listened. A young volunteer carrying supply forms hurried past Ryan and accidentally bumped the tray in his hands. One coffee tipped sideways, splashing onto the floor near his boots. "I am so sorry." The volunteer stammered immediately, kneeling to clean the mess with shaking hands. Ryan instinctively crouched beside him. "It is fine," he said quietly. The teenager looked exhausted, maybe 19 years old at most, with dark circles beneath his eyes and a rescue badge hanging crooked around his neck. "My mother is stuck in East Ward," the boy admitted under his breath while wiping the floor. "I have not heard from her since last night." Ryan felt something tighten inside him again. Earlier, he would have simply directed the volunteer back to work. Instead, he asked softly, "What is her address?" The boy blinked in surprise before answering. Ryan pulled a pen from his pocket and wrote the information carefully onto his notepad. "I know someone in search and rescue near that district," he said. "I will make sure they check." The volunteer stared at him for a second before nodding gratefully. Across the room, Evelyn noticed the interaction briefly while reviewing shelter capacities with emergency staff. Their eyes met for less than a moment. She said nothing, but Ryan saw it anyway. Not judgment, recognition. Outside the operations room windows, the storm clouds hanging over Ashbury had turned nearly black now, swallowing most of the afternoon light. Rain struck the glass in restless waves while distant sirens echoed through the flooded streets below. Inside, maps continued glowing red across the walls. Thousands of people still needed help before nightfall. And for the first time all day, Ryan Keller stopped thinking about how embarrassed he felt and started thinking about how useful he could still become. By early evening, City Hall no longer felt like a government building. It felt like the center of a storm trying desperately not to collapse under its own weight. Rain battered the windows nonstop, turning the skyline outside into a blur of gray lights and moving water. Emergency crews moved through hallways carrying boxes of satellite phones, blankets, bottled water, and portable generators while exhausted staff members slept briefly against walls between radio updates. The digital clock above the operations room read 7:42 p.m., but it felt much later. Governor Evelyn Brooks stood near the main operations table reviewing handwritten shelter reports because several computer systems had crashed under the flood response load. Her voice had grown softer through the day from exhaustion, yet somehow every person in the room still listened the moment she spoke. "Which evacuation shelters still do not have heat?" she asked while scanning another report. "3 confirmed so far," an aide answered quickly. "Possibly 5. Evelyn nodded once. "Move every portable generator from the West District storage facility tonight." Mayor Whitmore looked up sharply. "That reserve is for government buildings." Evelyn did not even glance at him when she answered. "Then government employees can wear coats." A few people around the table exchanged quiet looks. Nobody argued further. Ryan Keller stood near the communications wall monitoring incoming rescue updates, now, instead of guarding entrances. At some point during the afternoon, he had simply started helping wherever needed. Carrying supplies, relaying radio traffic, coordinating hallway access for emergency responders rushing between floors. Nobody officially asked him to do it. He just stopped standing still. Yet beneath every task sat the same uncomfortable truth replaying inside his mind. He could not stop thinking about the moment he grabbed her arm downstairs. Because she was governor. Because he never gave her the chance to simply be human first. A dispatcher's voice suddenly burst through the emergency speaker system overhead. Rescue teams are requesting immediate authorization for rooftop extraction at South Harbor Apartments. Water levels rising faster than expected. The room tightened instantly. Evelyn walked straight toward the operations monitor showing live drone footage from the flooded district. The image shook slightly in heavy rain, but dozens of people were visible gathered on apartment rooftops surrounded by dark floodwater reflecting emergency lights. One roof held several children wrapped in blankets beneath a flickering flashlight. How long until boats reach them? Evelyn asked. A coordinator checked another screen. 45 minutes minimum. They do not have 45 minutes, she replied quietly. Silence spread again. Rain pounded harder against the windows as thunder rolled across downtown Ashbury. Ryan stared at the monitor showing families stranded above rising water and felt his chest tighten. Suddenly, the volunteer from earlier rushed back into the room, holding a cell phone with trembling hands. They found my mother, he blurted out breathlessly. Relief cracked through his exhausted face all at once. Search and rescue got her out 2 blocks from East Ward. Ryan exhaled slowly without realizing he had been holding his breath. The young volunteer looked directly at him. Thank you, officer. Ryan nodded awkwardly, almost embarrassed by the gratitude. Across the room, Evelyn noticed the exchange again while studying the flood monitor. This time she walked toward him. The operations room seemed quieter around them despite the constant ringing phones and radio chatter. You made the call, she said simply. Ryan shifted slightly beneath the fluorescent lights. It was not difficult. Most important things are not difficult, Evelyn answered softly. They just require somebody to care enough to act. He looked down briefly at the radio clipped to his belt. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room around them continued moving in urgent waves of noise and exhaustion. But inside that silence, Ryan felt something unfamiliar settling into him. Shame, yes, but also clarity. Governor, he began carefully, about earlier today. Evelyn immediately turned back toward the monitors, fully focused once more. But Ryan remained standing still for 1 extra second beneath the cold white lights of the operations center, watching the governor move calmly through chaos while thunder shook the windows around them. And somewhere deep inside him, the definition of strength was beginning to change. Night settled over Ashbury like a heavy curtain soaked in rain. By 9:15, most of downtown had lost power completely, leaving only emergency lights and flashing rescue vehicles glowing through the storm outside City Hall. The operations room had grown quieter now, not because the crisis was improving, but because exhaustion had settled into every person inside it. Half-empty coffee cups sat abandoned beside glowing laptops. Jackets were draped over chairs. Some staff members rubbed their eyes while staring blankly at flood reports that no longer seemed real after 12 straight hours of emergency response. The constant sound of rainfall against the windows had become almost hypnotic, like static filling every silent space between conversations. Governor Evelyn Brooks stood alone near the far side of the room, beside a narrow window overlooking the dark city streets below. In the reflection against the glass, the soft blue light from the emergency monitors outlined the tiredness in her face more clearly than before. She held a printed shelter report in one hand, though her eyes no longer appeared focused on the page itself. For the first time all day, she looked still. Not powerful, not political, just human. Ryan Keller noticed it from across the room while organizing incoming radio updates near the communications table. Throughout the day, he had watched her move from crisis to crisis without slowing down once. Every answer calm, every decision measured, every person treated with dignity no matter their position. Yet now, standing quietly against the rain-dark window, she suddenly looked like someone carrying a weight nobody else in the building could fully see. He hesitated briefly before walking over. His boots echoed softly against the tile floor. "Governor," he said carefully. Evelyn turned slightly toward him. Faint reflection of emergency lights shimmered in her eyes. "Officer Keller." For a moment neither spoke. Outside, distant sirens drifted through flooded streets while thunder rolled low across the city skyline. Ryan glanced toward the report in her hand. "Shelter numbers?" She nodded once. "Over 4,000 displaced now." Her voice sounded quieter than earlier. "More tired. Some families have lost everything in less than 24 hours. Ryan looked down briefly. "My father was a firefighter," he said after a pause. "When I was young, he used to say storms show people who they really are." Evelyn studied him for a second. "And what do you think this storm is showing?" The question settled heavily between them. Ryan exhaled slowly. "That I spent years believing I was good at reading people." Rain streaked harder across the glass beside them. "This morning I saw your clothes, your race, the fact that you walked in alone, and somehow my brain filled in the rest before you even spoke. I told myself it was procedure, but it was more than procedure." Evelyn remained silent, letting the words sit without interrupting him. Ryan stared toward the flooded streets below. "What bothers me most is how normal it felt in the moment." The room behind them continued buzzing softly with emergency calls and keyboard clicks, but the corner near the window felt strangely still. Evelyn folded the shelter report slowly. "When I was 11 years old," she said quietly, "my mother cleaned office buildings downtown during the night shift." Ryan listened without moving. One winter evening, security stopped her outside a law office because they thought she stole a woman's purse. Her eyes remained fixed on the rain outside. She stood there in freezing weather for 40 minutes while people walked past pretending not to notice. Ryan felt his chest tighten. Evelyn finally looked toward him. "Do you know what she told me afterward?" He shook his head. "She said bitterness is expensive. It costs too much energy to carry every day." A faint smile touched her face for barely a second. "Dignity costs nothing. Nobody can take it unless you hand it away yourself." Silence returned between them. Not uncomfortable silence. Heavy silence. Honest silence. Somewhere behind them, another rescue update echoed across the operations room. More evacuations. More flooded streets. More families wading through darkness. Ryan looked at the governor beside the rain-covered window and understood something he had never fully grasped before. Strength was not loudness. It was not authority. It was not control. Sometimes strength looked like standing in a room full of people who underestimated you and still choosing compassion over humiliation. Outside, lightning briefly illuminated the flooded city in cold white flashes. Inside, the reflection of the storm shimmered softly across the window glass while the two of them stood quietly beneath the dim emergency lights, listening to the rain. At 11:03 p.m., the power failed across half of City Hall. The operations room dropped into darkness so suddenly that several people gasped before the emergency backup lights flickered on in cold, dim flashes along the ceiling. Computer monitors blinked out one by one. The steady hum of electronics disappeared, replaced by the sound of rain hammering the building and distant thunder rolling across the flooded city. "Backup generators are failing on the east grid," someone shouted from the communications desk. Instantly, the room erupted into motion again. Radios crackled. Flashlights cut through the darkness. Staff members rushed between tables carrying paper files because digital systems were no longer reliable. Through the tall windows, downtown Ashbury looked almost drowned beneath black water and scattered emergency lights. Governor Evelyn Brooks moved quickly toward the central operations board illuminated only by portable lanterns now. Shadows shifted across her face as she studied incoming rescue reports. "How many shelters just lost power?" she asked. "At least 4 confirmed," an aide answered breathlessly. "Possibly more." Evelyn nodded once, calm despite the chaos surrounding her. "Move every available generator to medical shelters first." Mayor Whitmore rubbed his forehead hard. "We barely have enough fuel reserves left." "Then prioritize oxygen equipment and heating stations," Evelyn replied immediately. "Nobody freezes tonight." Ryan Keller helped reposition emergency lighting near the communications wall while rescue updates continued pouring in faster than staff could process them. Sweat mixed with rainwater along the back of his uniform collar. The building felt smaller now, hotter, more desperate. Yet through all of it, Governor Brooks still spoke with the same measured steadiness she carried from the moment She entered City Hall earlier that day. A dispatcher's panicked voice suddenly burst through the main radio speaker. "We lost contact with rescue team 4 near South Harbor." The room froze instantly. "Repeat that," an emergency coordinator demanded. Static crackled loudly. Then the dispatcher answered again. "Boat engine failed during evacuation attempt. Team is stranded with civilians on top of a parking structure. Water still rising." Several officials exchanged alarmed looks. The parking structure sat directly beside the expanded flood zone. If water climbed another few feet overnight, the entire lower level would disappear beneath the current. Evelyn stepped closer to the radio. "How many civilians?" "Approximately 23, came the reply through static. "Including children." Silence hit the room heavily. Rain slammed harder against the windows like handfuls of gravel thrown from the sky. Ryan watched Mayor Whitmore glance nervously between emergency staff. Nobody wanted to say what everybody already understood. Conditions were becoming too dangerous for standard rescue boats to continue operating safely through the flooded streets. Evelyn looked toward the dark city outside, then back toward the operations map glowing weakly beneath lantern light. "What aerial support do we still have?" A coordinator shook his head. "National Guard helicopters cannot fly until the lightning passes." Another long silence followed. Ryan felt tension tightening across the room like wire pulled too far. Then suddenly he heard himself speak before fully thinking it through. "The old maintenance tunnel under Harbor Avenue." Heads turned toward him at once. Ryan stepped closer to the operations table. "It connects beneath the elevated rail line almost 2 blocks from the parking structure." One official frowned immediately. "That tunnel flooded years ago." "Partially," Ryan corrected. "But the upper access corridor stays above water unless the river completely breaches." Evelyn studied him carefully. "You know the route?" Ryan nodded once. "My father worked flood rescue down there after the storms back in '98. The governor looked down at the map while thunder rattled faintly through the walls. "How far can the tunnel get us?" "Close enough to reach the structure with smaller rescue rafts." Several coordinators immediately began arguing over safety risks, tunnel stability, and collapsing infrastructure. Their voices overlapped anxiously beneath the dim emergency lights. But Evelyn kept her eyes on Ryan. "Would you lead the route?" she asked quietly. The room fell silent again. Ryan felt his heartbeat thud heavily beneath his uniform. Earlier that morning he had reduced her to assumptions before she spoke a single sentence. And now she was trusting him with the lives of stranded families. Not because he deserved redemption, because people still needed help. Slowly, Ryan nodded. "Yes, Governor." Evelyn looked around the room. "Then prepare the rescue teams." Nobody argued after that. Outside, lightning flashed across the flooded skyline in brilliant white streaks, while emergency crews rushed to gather gear beneath the failing lights of City Hall. And standing there beside the operations table surrounded by maps, radios, and storm shadows, Ryan Keller realized trust felt far heavier than shame ever did. Tunnel entrance sat beneath Harbor Avenue behind a rusted maintenance gate, half hidden by floodwater and darkness. Rain poured from the overpass above in silver sheets illuminated by the flashing emergency lights of rescue vehicles lining the street. The smell of wet concrete, engine fuel, and river water filled the cold night air as rescue teams prepared inflatable rafts beside the opening. Governor Evelyn Brooks stood beneath a portable floodlight reviewing final evacuation updates, while wind pushed damp strands of hair against her face. Her dark coat was soaked again, but she seemed not to notice. Ryan Keller adjusted the flashlight attached to his rescue vest while staring into the narrow tunnel disappearing beneath the city. Water rushed loudly through the lower channels below, echoing like distant thunder against the concrete walls. One rescue worker shook his head nervously. "Visibility down there is terrible." Another checked rope lines and emergency oxygen packs with trembling hands. Nobody said it aloud, but everybody understood the risk. Tunnel flooded completely while teams were inside. There would be no fast way out. Evelyn stepped toward Ryan near the tunnel entrance. Around them, emergency crews moved quickly beneath rotating red lights reflecting off puddles and rain-slicked pavement. "You still know the path?" she asked quietly. Ryan nodded once. "My father brought me here years ago during flood inspections." He glanced toward the darkness ahead. "The upper corridor should stay passable if the support walls still hold." Evelyn studied him carefully for a moment. Then she reached into her coat pocket and handed him a small folded emergency map sealed inside plastic. "Take this anyway." Ryan accepted it silently. Rain tapped softly against the plastic covering between his fingers. "Governor," he began slowly, "after what happened this morning, you really should not be trusting me like this. It is about deciding whether they are willing to become better afterward." The words settled deeply into him. Ryan lowered his eyes briefly, ashamed all over again. "I judged you before I even heard your voice." Evelyn nodded gently. "I know." There was no anger in her face when she said it. Somehow that made it harder to carry. Nearby, rescue workers finished inflating the final raft, while emergency radios crackled with updates from the stranded families trapped atop the parking structure. Children still waiting. Water still rising. One dispatcher's voice trembled while relaying the latest conditions. "The lower stairwell is underwater now." Lightning flashed across the skyline, briefly illuminating the governor standing beneath the rain beside the tunnel entrance. Ryan looked at her carefully then, not as a title, not as authority, but simply as a person. Exhausted, soaked, working through the night while half the city panicked around her. "Most people in your position would have humiliated me publicly hours ago," he admitted quietly. Evelyn folded her arms against the cold wind. Humiliation does not heal anything. The rain intensified around them. People learn faster from dignity than shame. Ryan felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. For years he had believed discipline alone fixed mistakes. Punishment, embarrassment, force. Yet standing there in the freezing rain beside the woman he failed to recognize that morning, he understood why everybody inside City Hall followed her without hesitation now. Not because she demanded respect, because she gave it first. A rescue coordinator jogged toward them breathlessly. "We have to move now before the water rises any higher." Ryan nodded immediately. He turned toward the tunnel entrance where darkness swallowed the narrow corridor beneath Harbor Avenue. Rescue workers lifted the inflatable raft carefully into the rushing water, while emergency lights painted red reflections across the concrete walls. Before stepping toward the tunnel, Ryan looked back once more at Evelyn Brooks standing beneath the storm. "I will bring them back," he said. Evelyn held his gaze steadily. "I know you will." No speech, no dramatic command. Just quiet faith spoken beneath cold rain and flashing rescue lights. Ryan nodded once and disappeared into the tunnel beside the rescue team, while thunder rolled across the flooded city overhead. Evelyn remained standing near the entrance long after the darkness swallowed their lights completely, listening to the storm, the rushing water, and the distant sound of sirens echoing through the sleeping streets of Ashbury. The rescue teams emerged from the Harbor Avenue tunnel just after 2 a.m. beneath freezing rain and flashing ambulance lights. One by one, exhausted families wrapped in emergency blankets climbed carefully from the inflatable rafts onto the flooded street, while paramedics guided children toward warming buses parked nearby. The water had risen almost to waist level near the parking structure by the time Ryan Keller and the rescue crews reached it, but every civilian stranded on the rooftop made it out safely before the current swallowed the lower access ramps completely. City Hall staff standing beneath portable floodlights began applauding softly the moment the final raft reached shore. Not loud celebration. Relief. The kind that leaves people too tired to cheer properly. Governor Evelyn Brooks stood near the emergency vehicles watching each family step onto dry pavement. Rain still fell steadily around her, silver under the rotating red and blue lights reflecting across the floodwater. A little girl wrapped in a thermal blanket stopped beside Evelyn before boarding one of the buses. "Are you the governor?" she asked quietly. Evelyn smiled gently and crouched slightly despite the exhaustion written across her face. "Tonight, I am just someone glad you are safe." Yet for the first time all day, the tightness inside his chest had eased slightly. Not disappeared, but changed. He watched the governor move calmly through the rescue site, speaking softly with paramedics, volunteers, and frightened families without once drawing attention back to herself. No cameras surrounded her now. Most reporters had already retreated from the storm hours earlier. Yet she remained exactly the same person she had been when the lights were brightest. Mayor Whitmore approached, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee from a nearby emergency truck. He handed one carefully to Evelyn. Steam curled into the cold night air between them. "The shelter directors are calling this the largest overnight rescue operation Ashbury has completed in decades," he said quietly. Evelyn accepted the cup with both hands for warmth. "Rescue officer," Ryan watched the vehicle doors close softly. Earlier that day, he had worn the uniform like armor, something that separated him from people. Tonight it felt different somehow, more like responsibility than authority. He turned and noticed Evelyn watching him from across the street beneath the rain. Their eyes met briefly through the flashing reflections of emergency lights dancing across the floodwater. Ryan walked toward her slowly. Water splashed softly beneath his boots while the storm finally began weakening overhead. "Everybody made it out," he said quietly. Evelyn nodded once. "Because people work together." Ryan lowered his eyes for a moment before speaking again. "I spent years believing respect came from being the one in control." Rain tapped lightly against the shoulders of his soaked uniform. "But tonight, I realized real leadership looks different than I thought." Evelyn held the warm coffee cup near her face against the cold wind drifting through the flooded street. "Most important lessons arrive disguised as uncomfortable moments," she said softly. Ryan let out a small breath that almost became a laugh. "That is one way to describe today." For the first time since morning, Evelyn smiled fully. Not politically. Human. Tired. Real. Behind them, emergency buses slowly pulled away, carrying rescued families toward heated shelters, while dawn began faintly softening the edge of the storm clouds above Ashbury. The city remained flooded. Thousands of people still faced difficult days ahead. But the darkness was finally beginning to loosen. Ryan looked across the street toward the distant outline of City Hall, barely visible through the mist and rain. Earlier that morning, he had stopped a tired black woman at the door because he thought she did not belong inside power. Now, standing beneath the fading storm with cold rain dripping from his sleeves, he understood something that would stay with him long after the floodwaters disappeared. The strongest people are often the ones society overlooks first. And sometimes the quietest dignity in the room carries more power than every title hanging on the walls of government buildings combined. As the first pale light of morning touched the flooded streets, Governor Evelyn Brooks turned toward the waiting rescue crews and walked forward through the rain, while the city slowly woke behind her.